He never came home. That was the simple, brutal fact that settled over the Brooks apartment on a cold Friday night in October of 2015. The city of Washington, D.C. continued its relentless rhythm outside their window, a symphony of distant sirens, rumbling buses, and the murmur of a world indifferent to the small, gaping hole that had just opened in their lives. Maria Brooks stood by the window, her hand pressed against the cool glass, watching the 6:45 p.m. bus hiss to a stop and pull away empty. Of the one passenger she was waiting for, the smell of the chicken she'd kept warm on the stove began to feel like a cruel joke. In the quiet of their two-bedroom apartment in Anacostia, a new kind of silence began to grow. A heavy, suffocating presence that was far more terrifying than any noise. It was the sound of a promise broken, of a routine shattered, of a boy who was simply gone. Before that night, Lena Brooks's life was measured in predictable cycles of exhaustion and duty. She was 22, but a weariness had settled deep into her bones, the kind that comes from sleeping while the sun is high and working while the city sleeps. Her days were inverted, a strange half-life spent in the quiet of their apartment, before she put on her gray uniform and took the long bus ride downtown. There, she moved like a ghost through the opulent, empty offices of a corporate law firm, her presence marked only by the scent of ammonia and the hum of her floor buffer on polished marble. Her own artistic ambitions, once a vibrant fire, were now banked embers, set aside to help her mother, Maria, and to ensure her younger brother, Evan, had a chance at the life she couldn't grasp for herself. She was the family's silent anchor, holding everything together with a strength she rarely felt she possessed. Their home was a small world, tucked away on the third floor of a brick building that had seen better decades. The air inside was a constant mix of Maria's fatigue, the faint, lingering smell of the hospital disinfectant from her home health aide uniform, and the sharp, clean scent of lead from Evan's pencils. Love was the mortar holding the cracked walls together, but financial precarity was a constant, subtle pressure. It was in the worn-out sofa, the flickering fluorescent light in the kitchen, and the careful way Maria would portion out meals. Yet, the space was saved from despair by Evan's art. His vivid sketches of city life, a woman waiting for a bus, the intricate pattern of a wrought iron fence, the flight of a pigeon, were taped over peeling paint, vibrant windows into a world seen through his uniquely perceptive eyes. He was their shared hope, the reason for every double shift and every deferred dream. Evan was the bridge between their world and another. At 12, he was a quiet, observant boy, with a talent so clear and bright, it had earned him a scholarship to the prestigious St. Albans Middle School, a world away in the manicured, old-money enclave of Northwest D.C. Each morning he would put on a crisp uniform that cost more than their weekly groceries, becoming a visitor in a land of inherited confidence and casual wealth. His sketchbooks were filled with the details of this other life, but also with the faces of his own neighborhood, a testament to his ability to exist in both spaces while belonging fully to neither. For Lena and Maria, his scholarship felt like a winning lottery ticket, a fragile, precious key that might unlock a future free from the anxieties that defined their present. They never considered that the same key could also unlock a door to a different kind of danger. The other world, the one Evan visited daily and Lena cleaned nightly, was a place of immense, unthinking power. It was the world of Marcus Thorne, a real estate magnate whose name was etched onto the city's most ambitious development projects. It was a world Lena knew only by its surfaces, the weight of solid oak doors, the scent of expensive leather chairs in silent boardrooms, the panoramic views of a city skyline from 40 floors up. As she emptied the trash cans of men who shaped legislation and moved markets, she felt her own invisibility most acutely. She was a necessary but unseen function, a shadow tidying up the remnants of lives lived on a scale she could barely comprehend. It was in this world, in a historic brownstone in Georgetown owned by Thorne himself, that her brother Evan was supposed to be, working on a school project with Thorne's son, before he stepped out and vanished into the autumn air. Lena's days began when the cities were ending. The afternoon sun, weak and slanted, would filter through the thin curtains of her bedroom, a gentle summons to a life lived in reverse. She'd wake to the sounds of the neighborhood coming alive outside, the rhythmic bounce of a basketball on the pavement below, the distant rumble of the metro, the murmur of conversations drifting up from the sidewalk. For a few moments, she would lie still, listening, feeling the profound disconnect of a world that was winding down just as hers was beginning. In the corner of her room, a wooden easel and a set of charcoal pencils lay under a thin sheet, gathering a soft layer of dust. They were artifacts from a different life, a dream she had carefully packed away like old clothes, promising herself she'd return to them one day, a day that never seemed to arrive. The turn of her mother's key in the lock around 4 p.m. was the true start of their shared evening. Maria would enter like a tide receding, leaving behind a faint trail of antiseptic and weariness. Her home health aid scrubs, a pale blue, seemed to carry the weight of her long day. The first thing she always did was slip off her worn-out sneakers, sighing as her feet touched the cool linoleum of the entryway. Lena would have a glass of water ready for her, a small, unspoken ritual of care. Maria would sink into the sagging floral print armchair, the one with the permanent indentation of her body, and close her eyes for a few minutes, gathering the strength to transition from caregiver to mother, a shift that offered no rest, only a different kind of exhaustion. Their apartment was a testament to making do. It was small, with walls that seemed to breathe with the building's age, but Maria and Lena had made it a home. Evan's vibrant sketches were taped over the spots where the paint had peeled, transforming cracks into frames for his art. His drawings of street scenes, portraits of neighbors, and intricate studies of birds in flight gave the rooms a life and color the landlord's beige paint never could. The furniture was a collection of second-hand finds, each piece softened and shaped by years of use. A constant low hum from the old refrigerator in the kitchen provided the apartment's baseline soundtrack, a sound so familiar that its absence would have been more jarring than its presence. It was a space held together by necessity, but filled with a stubborn, quiet love. The kitchen was the warmest room in the house, both in temperature and in spirit. It smelled perpetually of onions, garlic, and whatever simple meal Maria was stretching to feed the three of them. Her movements were a study in efficiency, honed by years of tight budgets and limited time. She could turn a pound of ground meat and some rice into a savory, filling dinner that felt like a feast. Lena often stood beside her, chopping vegetables or washing dishes, their work a silent, synchronized dance. They rarely needed to speak. In the cramped space, surrounded by the hiss of the frying pan and the scent of browning chicken, they found a simple communion. Sharing a meal at their small, wobbly table was the one anchor in their constantly shifting days, a moment of guaranteed togetherness. Evan was the quiet center of their small universe. After school, he would claim his spot at the kitchen table, his homework spread out on one side and a fresh sketchbook on the other. The soft, rhythmic scratching of his pencil on paper was a comforting, constant sound in the apartment. He worked with a focused intensity that was rare for a boy his age. His brow furrowed in concentration as he captured the world around him. He didn't just draw what he saw. He drew what he felt, infusing a sketch of a tired woman on the bus with a profound sense of dignity, or the pattern of a chain-link fence with a kind of stark beauty. His art was his language, and, through it, he filled their small home with a sense of wonder and boundless possibility. Outside their window, Anacostia was a symphony of life. The sounds were a constant rolling soundtrack to their existence. The bass-heavy beat from a car passing on the street below, the joyful shouts of children playing tag until dusk, the mournful distant wail of an ambulance siren cutting through the evening air. Their building was a microcosm of the neighborhood, a place of hard-working families, of resilience forged in the face of systemic neglect. It was a community that looked out for its own, where neighbors knew each other by name and a shared pot of coffee was always brewing somewhere. Lena, Maria, and Evan were a quiet part of this fabric, their lives interwoven with the countless other stories unfolding behind the brick facades of their street, largely invisible to the rest of the city. Each evening, Lena's commute was a journey across invisible borders. She would walk to the bus, stop under streetlights that were just beginning to flicker on, joining the other night shift workers. The bus ride was long, taking her west, away from the familiar brick of her neighborhood and across the river. She watched through the window as the city transformed. The corner stores and low-rise apartments of Southeast gave way to the grand, imposing federal buildings of downtown, then to the manicured lawns and stately historic homes of the Northwest. It felt like traveling between different countries, each with its own language and customs. By the time she stepped off the bus into the rarefied air of the financial district, she felt as if she had shed her own identity, preparing to become a ghost for the next 8 hours. The law firm was another world entirely. After the last of the associates had departed in their expensive cars, a profound cathedral-like silence descended upon the offices. Lena's footsteps were the only sound, echoing softly on the polished marble floors of the lobby. The air smelled of money, a clean, sterile mix of expensive leather, wood polish, and old paper. She moved methodically through the deserted hallways, her cleaning cart gliding silently behind her. She was surrounded by the artifacts of immense power. Mahogany desks that cost more than her mother's annual salary, walls adorned with abstract art, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a glittering panoramic view of a city she could see but never truly touch. She was an invisible custodian of this empire, present only to erase any trace of the day's labor. Her work was a series of intimate intrusions into lives she would never know. She emptied wastebaskets filled with crumpled legal drafts, discarded lunch receipts from expensive restaurants, and the occasional scribbled, frustrated note. She wiped down massive boardroom tables where the fates of companies and people were decided, polishing away the faint rings left by coffee cups and the ghostly smudges of fingerprints. She saw the remnants of power, the debris left in its wake. This proximity to wealth and influence only amplified her own sense of anonymity. She was a necessary function, like the electricity or the plumbing, essential for the smooth operation of this world, but completely unseen by its inhabitants. The contrast between their casual excess and her careful frugality was a quiet, heavy weight she carried every night. Financial pressure was a constant low-grade fever in the Brooks household. It lived in the stack of envelopes on the corner of the kitchen counter, a silent testament to bills that were always due. Lena would see her mother at the table late at night, a pen in her hand and a worried line creasing her brow, performing the painful arithmetic of their survival. The strain meant a life of deferred desires. A new winter coat was a luxury, a trip to the movies was a rare treat, and Lena's dream of taking a night class in painting was an impossibility they never even discussed. Their dreams were practical, immediate, making rent on time, keeping the lights on, ensuring there was always enough food in the refrigerator. They were skilled at the art of getting by, but the effort it required was slowly, imperceptibly wearing them down. The bond between Lena and Evan was fierce and protective. She was 10 years older, and she had slipped into a role that was part sister, part guardian, part confidant. She was the one who checked his homework, who listened patiently to his detailed stories about his day at St. Albans, a world of privilege and tradition that felt like a foreign land. She was his fiercest advocate, marveling at each new drawing he produced, carefully taping them to the walls as if they were priceless masterpieces. In her eyes, they were. She saw his talent not just as a gift, but as a responsibility. Her responsibility. She would do anything to ensure that his light was not dimmed by the same harsh realities that had forced her to put her own dreams away in a dusty corner. Evan's scholarship was the family's most prized possession, a fragile key that they believed could unlock a different future. It was their collective winning lottery ticket, a source of immense pride and quiet, unspoken pressure. For Maria and Lena, Evan's success was their success. Every A on his report card, every piece of praise from a teacher was a validation of their sacrifices. He was carrying the weight of their hopes on his small, 12-year-old shoulders. They saw in him a chance to break the cycle of exhaustion and financial struggle that had defined their lives. He was their bridge to a world where talent was recognized and rewarded, a world beyond the confines of Anacostia. And they poured all of their love and energy into strengthening that bridge, never imagining how fragile it truly was. Amid the constant struggle, there were small, incandescent moments of joy that sustained them. They were found in the simple act of huddling together on their worn sofa to watch an old movie, sharing a single bowl of popcorn passed between them. They were in the sound of Evan's laughter as he showed Lena a funny caricature he'd drawn of one of his teachers, or in the rare, unburdened smile that would briefly illuminate Maria's tired face when one of her children said something that made her proud. These moments were their sanctuary, a quiet rebellion against the weight of their circumstances. They were fleeting and precious, tiny pockets of light in which they could forget the bills on the counter and the long shifts ahead, and simply be a family, whole and content in their small, love-filled world. A quiet, unspoken grief for their father, who had died from a sudden heart attack 5 years prior, was a permanent resident in their apartment. His presence lingered in a single faded photograph on a small end table. A smiling man with kind eyes, his arm wrapped around a younger, less weary Maria. Sometimes, Lena would catch her mother staring at the photo, her expression distant, lost in a memory of a life that felt a world away. Maria rarely spoke of him, but her loss had been forged into a quiet, steely resilience. All the love she had for her husband was now channeled with fierce intensity toward her children. Her strength wasn't loud or demonstrative. It was in the endless double shifts, the carefully prepared meals, the unwavering belief in Evan's future. Ultimately, their life was defined by a profound sense of invisibility. Lena felt it most acutely as she moved, ghost-like, through the empty, opulent offices downtown. But it was a feeling that extended to their entire existence. They were part of the vast, essential machinery that kept the city running, the cleaners, the caregivers, the bus drivers, yet they remained unseen by the powerful people whose lives they serviced. Their struggles were private, their sacrifices unacknowledged, their dreams too small to register on the city's grand scale. They were good, hardworking people living a quiet, dignified life in the margins. This was their normal, the accepted reality of their world. They had no reason to believe that the powerful, indifferent city would ever turn its gaze upon them. That Friday in October began like any other Friday, which is to say, with the weak afternoon sun filtering through Lena's bedroom window around 3:15 p.m. It was a gentle, apologetic light, the kind that signaled the day was already winding down. For most of the city, just as hers was beginning, she lay still for a moment, listening to the familiar sounds of Anacostia filtering up from the street, the rhythmic thump of a basketball, the distant, mournful cry of a siren, the overlapping voices of neighbors returning from work. In her corner, the wooden easel and a set of charcoal pencils were covered by a thin sheet, silent witnesses to a deferred dream. She rose with the familiar ache of a body not meant for this schedule, the feeling of another ordinary, exhausting day stretching out before her, giving no hint of the abyss that was waiting. The turn of her mother's key in the lock at 4:30 p.m. was the day's true beginning. Maria entered not with a rush, but with a slow, heavy exhale, as if she were releasing the accumulated weight of a 12-hour shift. She slipped off her worn-out sneakers at the door, a small daily ritual of shedding the outside world. Lena had a glass of water waiting on the counter, and Maria took it with a grateful, weary nod before sinking into her designated armchair. She closed her eyes for a few minutes, a silent transition from the demands of her patients to the needs of her family. It was in these quiet moments that Lena saw the full extent of her mother's exhaustion, the fine lines of worry etched around her eyes, a map of their constant, unending struggle for simple survival. Evan was already at the kitchen table, the nucleus of their small home. He was surrounded by his school books on one side and a fresh, open sketchbook on the other, the soft scratching of his pencil a constant, comforting rhythm. He looked up and smiled as Lena came in, his eyes bright with excitement. "Look," he said, turning the sketchbook around. It was a detailed, preliminary drawing of the U.S. Capitol building for his history project with Julian Thorne. He spoke of the Thorne House with a kind of hushed awe, describing the library filled with old books and the quiet, cavernous rooms. "It's like a museum you can live in," he whispered. And for a moment, Lena and Maria felt a shared surge of pride, believing he was exactly where he was meant to be. Maria pushed herself out of the chair, her brief rest over, and began the familiar motions of preparing dinner. The kitchen soon filled with the comforting, savory smell of frying chicken and onions. They ate together at their small, wobbly table, their last meal as a complete family, though they had no way of knowing it. The conversation was light, revolving around Evan's project. Maria gave him his bus fare and made him repeat the route back home, her maternal anxiety a constant, gentle hum beneath the surface. "Be home by 7, you hear me? Don't be late," she instructed, her voice firm but loving. He nodded seriously, his mouth full of rice, completely unaware of the weight those simple words would soon carry for the rest of their lives. A final, unheeded warning. At a little before 5, Evan stood by the door, pulling on his thin jacket against the autumn chill. His backpack, heavy with his sketchbook and history textbook, seemed almost too big for his slight frame. Lena straightened his collar, a small, instinctive gesture of care. "Have fun," she told him, managing a smile. "And be good." He gave her a quick, one-armed hug, and then did the same to his mother. "I will. See you later." The door clicked shut behind him, and they heard his sneakers thudding down the 3 flights of stairs to the street. They listened, until the sound faded, replaced by the familiar noises of the building. It was a perfectly normal departure, a routine event in a routine day, silent and unremarkable in every way. Lena's own routine began soon after. She changed into her gray work uniform, the fabric stiff and impersonal. As she pinned her hair back, she thought of Evan, imagining him in that grand Georgetown house, his head bent over his sketchbook, his talent shining even in that world of immense privilege. The thought brought a small, fierce sense of pride. She walked to her own bus stop as the sky deepened to a bruised purple, joining the other night shift workers on their migration across the city. The long ride took her away from the warm, lived-in world of her neighborhood and into the cold, sterile heart of downtown. By the time she stepped into the silent, marble-floored lobby of the law firm, her family life felt a world away, a place she would return to in 8 hours, unchanged. The clock on the kitchen wall ticked past 7, then 7:15. Maria stood by the window, watching the street below. Each passing set of headlights was a flicker of hope that was quickly extinguished. The chicken she'd kept warm for Evan was now cold on its plate. Finally, at 7:40, she picked up the phone and dialed the number for the Thorne residence she'd written on a notepad. Julian's mother answered, her voice polite, smooth, and distant. "Oh, Evan left a while ago," she said, a hint of surprise in her tone. "Julian said they finished up their work around 6:30. He should have been home ages ago." The words were delivered with a casual finality, a simple statement of fact that dropped like a stone into the quiet, anxious apartment. By 8:30, the anxiety had curdled into a sharp, undeniable fear. Maria paced the length of their small living room, her hands twisting in the fabric of her apron. She had called Evan's phone over and over, each time being sent directly to the cold, impersonal silence of his voicemail. Her calls to his friends yielded nothing. With trembling hands, she finally called Lena at work. Her voice was thin and tight, a wire stretched to its breaking point. "He's not home, Lena. He never came home." In the cathedral-like silence of the 42nd floor, surrounded by the polished surfaces of immense power, Lena felt a cold dread wash over her. The two worlds she inhabited had just violently collided. "I'm on my way," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He had stepped out of the Thorne's massive oak door at 6:35 p.m., the crisp evening air a shock after the stuffy warmth of the house. The Georgetown street was quiet, the glow of antique gas lamps just beginning to push back against the gathering dusk. He adjusted his backpack, feeling the satisfying weight of his completed project notes, and began the short walk toward the bus stop on Wisconsin Avenue. A dark, expensive-looking sedan slowed to a halt beside him, its engine a low purr. The passenger window glided down, revealing the smiling, familiar face of his history teacher, Mr. Alistair Finch. "Evan, there you are," he said, his voice a warm pocket in the cold air. "Heading home? Don't wait for the bus. Let me give you a ride." It was an offer of kindness from a respected teacher. Evan hesitated for only a second before nodding gratefully. The back door clicked open, an invitation. He got in. The door closed with a solid, definitive thud. The car pulled smoothly away from the curb, turning left, away from the bus stop. Lena arrived home just after 9 to a scene of suspended animation. The apartment was eerily quiet, the television dark. Her mother was sitting at the kitchen table, the phone resting in its cradle, her face a pale, stricken mask. She had just finished her first call to the police, a conversation filled with procedural questions and frustratingly calm assurances. The plate of food set for Evan was still on the counter, a tragic, untouched offering. His humor sketchbook lay open next to it, a half-finished drawing of a pigeon in flight looking up from the page, its wings outstretched but going nowhere. The familiar, comforting space of their home had become a vacuum, defined not by what was there, but by the one person who was not. The silence in the room was a living thing, a vast, suffocating presence that had already begun to swallow their world whole. The first official visit was from two uniformed officers who looked too young, their faces etched with a practiced solemnity that didn't quite reach their eyes. They stood in the small living room, their bulky vests and utility belts making the space shrink, their presence an intrusion of cold procedural reality into the family's raw panic. Maria, wrapped in a thin housecoat, could only repeat his name. "Evan. My Evan." Her voice a shredded whisper. The officers asked questions that felt like accusations. Did he have any reason to run away? Any arguments at home? Lena answered for her mother, her own voice tight and controlled, a dam holding back a flood of terror. The smell of the cold, uneaten chicken on the counter seemed to mock them, a relic from a life that had ended just hours before. Dawn arrived not with warmth, but with a harsh, unforgiving gray light that illuminated the sleeplessness on Lena's and Maria's faces. The apartment, once their sanctuary, now felt like a crime scene. Every familiar object a painful piece of evidence. Evan's worn sneakers were still by the door, the laces tied exactly as he'd left them. His favorite mug was in the dish rack. The quiet was no longer peaceful. It was a physical weight, a thick, suffocating blanket that pressed down on them. Lena made a pot of coffee, the bitter aroma filling the kitchen, but neither of them touched it. They sat at the small table where they had shared their last meal, suspended in the horrifying disbelief that a world that had been whole yesterday was now irrevocably broken, its center torn. Away. Word traveled through the building and along the block with the morning light, a current of shared dread. Mrs. Gable from the second floor, who always watched Evan leave for school from her window, was the first to knock, holding a plate of muffins they couldn't eat, her face a mask of worried sympathy. The news spread from stoop to stoop, a story of a good boy, their neighborhood's bright star, who had crossed the river into that other world and simply vanished. It wasn't idle gossip. It was a collective fear that resonated deeply in a community accustomed to being overlooked. Parents held their own children's hands a little tighter that morning, their eyes lingering on the empty bus stop, feeling the Brooks family's private nightmare as a terrifying possibility for them all. By early afternoon, Lena was standing at a copy shop, her hands trembling as she fed dollar bills into the machine. She used Evan's latest school photograph, the one where his smile was slightly crooked and his eyes shone with a future that now felt like a cruel fiction. Above his face, the word missing sat in stark, brutal black letters. Back in Anacostia, she and a handful of neighbors began the grim ritual of taping the flyers to lampposts, bus shelters, and the windows of corner stores. Each piece of tape was a desperate prayer, a fragile plea sent out into the indifferent city. Evan's smiling face was suddenly everywhere, a paper ghost looking out at the streets he used to walk. His image, plastered over a world that had somehow lost him. The first news van arrived late that afternoon, its sterile white shell and large satellite dish feeling like an alien intrusion on their quiet street. A reporter with a practiced, somber expression intercepted Lena at the entrance to their building, a microphone extended like a weapon. "Can you tell us how you're feeling?" she asked, the question so absurdly inadequate that Lena could only stare back in numb silence. The unblinking red light of the camera felt like a violation, transforming their private agony into a public spectacle. They were no longer just a family, they were a story, a human interest segment to be consumed between commercials. The Thorne connection had made their tragedy irresistible, a compelling narrative of class and misfortune for the 6 o'clock news. A statement was issued not from the Thorne family directly, but through a high-priced public relations firm in a crisp, emotionless email. It was a carefully calibrated expression of deep concern and a promise of full cooperation with the authorities. When a journalist caught Marcus Thorne leaving his downtown office, he spoke in measured, grave tones about the terrible tragedy, calling Evan a wonderful, talented boy. Yet he subtly steered the narrative, letting it slip that Evan had been fine when he left their home, suggesting the trouble must have found him on his journey back. The unspoken implication hung heavy in the air. The danger wasn't in the manicured safety of Georgetown, but in the streets of the boy's own neighborhood. Detective Harding arrived that evening, a man who looked as if he carried the weight of every unsolved case in the city on his stooped shoulders. He sat on their worn floral sofa, which sank beneath his bulk, and asked questions that felt laced with a weary cynicism. He wanted to know about their finances, about Evan's deceased father, about any friends who might be a bad influence. To him they were a familiar story from a part of the city where boys went missing for predictable reasons. He listened to Maria's frantic, broken narrative with a professional patience that was colder and more infuriating than outright dismissal. Lena watched him, a slow, hot anger building in her gut. He wasn't looking for her brother. He was looking for a narrative that fit. While the police moved with the slow, grinding pace of bureaucracy, the community mobilized. Their pastor, Reverend Michael, organized search parties that fanned out as dusk fell, combing through the local parks and the wooded banks of the Anacostia River. Armed with flashlights and a desperate, fragile hope, they called Evan's name into the growing darkness, their voices swallowed by the vastness of the night. Lena walked with them, her own throat raw, her feet aching, her eyes scanning every shadow. She saw the faces of her neighbors, tired from their own long workdays, but resolute. It was a heartbreaking display of solidarity, a small, weary army of the invisible trying to find one of their own, doing the work the powerful city seemed unwilling to do. The flyers generated a storm of phone calls, each one a small, cruel flicker of hope. A truck driver thought he saw a boy matching Evan's description at a rest stop in Virginia. A woman was certain she'd seen him on a downtown bus, looking sad. Each lead was meticulously followed by Lena, and each one dissolved into nothing, leaving them emptier than before. The story became fodder for late-night radio shows, where anonymous callers spun theories of ransom plots and gang initiations. Strangers felt entitled to dissect their lives, to speculate on their pain, turning their unimaginable loss into a morbid form of public entertainment. Their grief was no longer their own. It had become common property. Mr. Henderson, an elderly man from the first floor, who spent most evenings watching the street from his armchair, told Detective Harding he'd seen a dark, expensive-looking sedan parked on the corner around dusk on Friday. He hadn't thought anything of it at the time, but now it felt significant. "It wasn't a car from around here," he insisted, his voice thin and reedy. "Too clean, too quiet. Just sat there for a while." Harding wrote it down in his little notebook with a non-committal grunt, his expression unreadable. To the family, it felt like the first solid piece of a puzzle, a tangible clue in a world that had become abstract with horror. To the detective, it was just another unverifiable detail in a file already thick with them. The contrast between their two worlds became a form of daily torture. While Lena and Maria spent hours in the sterile, fluorescent-lit waiting room of the police precinct, which smelled of burnt coffee and anxiety, the city's society pages showed Marcus Thorne and his wife smiling at a black-tie charity fundraiser. The caption mentioned their family's distress over the unfortunate situation involving their son's friend, before moving on to praise Thorne's generous donation. The juxtaposition was nauseating. Their world had stopped, shattered into a million pieces of grief and fear, while the world Evan had briefly visited continued on its orbit, insulated and untouched, their apocalypse reduced to a passing mention, a minor inconvenience politely acknowledged before the champagne was poured. Days bled into weeks, and the initial frantic energy began to recede, replaced by a vast, aching emptiness. The news vans moved on to the next tragedy, the phone calls dwindled, and the neighborhood search parties disbanded. The apartment became a shrine to Evan's absence. His bedroom door remained closed, the space within a perfectly preserved moment in time. His sketchbook open on the desk, his pajamas folded on his pillow. Lena would sometimes stand in the doorway, afraid to enter, breathing in the faint, lingering scent of graphite and paper. The silence in their home was no longer a temporary lull. It was a permanent tenant, a hollow, resonant echo in the space where his life used to be. The unending strain of not knowing began to erode Maria. The resilient woman who had worked double shifts and held their world together with sheer force of will started to disappear. She stopped going to work, unable to endure the well-meaning but painful questions. She would spend her days on the sofa, staring at the television without seeing it, or rereading the single-pager. Police report as if its sparse, bureaucratic language might suddenly yield a secret. The light in her eyes dimmed, replaced by a distant, haunted look. Lena watched her mother fade, a new and terrifying weight settling on her own shoulders. She was no longer just a sister searching for her brother. She was the sole guardian of a family that was quietly disintegrating. Driven by the brutal necessity of rent and bills, Lena returned to her night shift job. But the work had changed. The silent, opulent offices no longer felt merely separate from her life. They felt obscene. As she polished the massive mahogany boardroom table where men like Marcus Thorne decided the fate of skylines, a cold, hard anger began to solidify in her heart. Her own invisibility, once a simple fact of her job, now felt like a weapon. During the day, she began her own quiet investigation, methodically retracing Evan's bus route, talking to drivers and shopkeepers, her grief slowly sharpening into a single, relentless purpose. She would not let them forget. She would not let him become just another statistic in a forgotten file. The first snow of the season came in early December, a quiet, steady fall that blanketed the city in a deceptive layer of purity and peace. It covered the faded, missing posters still clinging to lampposts, Evan's smiling face slowly disappearing under a thin shroud of white. The cold seeped through the window frames of their apartment, a physical manifestation of the permanent chill that had settled in their bones. From the 42nd floor of the law firm, Lena watched the pristine snow fall on the glittering, indifferent city below. A beautiful, silent spectacle that felt like a profound betrayal. The world was moving on, covering up the past. But in their small apartment, time remained frozen on that cold October night. Trapped in the endless, agonizing moment, their boy walked out the door and never came back. The first year passed like a long, slow drowning. Hope, a frantic and exhausting thing, eventually receded, leaving behind a barren landscape of grief. Evan's 13th birthday came and went in a haze of suffocating silence. Maria bought a small cake from the grocery store, but it sat on the kitchen counter untouched until Lena finally threw it away, its cheerful frosting a grotesque mockery. The missing posters, once crisp and urgent, became a part of the city's grimy wallpaper. Their ink bled in the rain, and the sun bleached Evan's smiling face into a pale, ghostly image. They were no longer a call to action but a tattered memorial, a testament to a question the city had stopped asking. The frantic search had devolved into a grim, mechanical ritual of existence, each day a repetition of the one before, defined only by the gaping hole at its center. By the third year, the case was officially declared cold. Detective Harding had retired, taking his weary cynicism with him, and Evan's file was handed to a new detective, who had never seen his face or heard his mother's broken pleas. The file was just paperwork now, a bureaucratic artifact of a forgotten tragedy. Maria had retreated so far into herself that she barely left the apartment. The outside world, with its casual happiness and forward momentum, was an unbearable affront. Lena became her keeper, her life shrinking to the predictable circuit between their silent, grief-soaked apartment and the sterile, empty offices downtown. The world had moved on, spinning forward on its axis. But for the Brooks women, time had become a closed loop, forever circling the black hole of that October night, a prison of memory from which there was no escape. Evan's bedroom remained a perfectly preserved wound, a shrine to a life interrupted. Lena kept the door closed, but the space had its own gravitational pull. Dust motes danced in the single shaft of afternoon light that cut through the blinds, illuminating a world frozen in time. His clothes still hung in. The closet, shirts and jeans that the boy he would have become had long outgrown. His pencils lay scattered on his desk next to a sketchbook open to a half-finished drawing. The scent of him, once so distinct, had long since faded, replaced by the dry, stale smell of dust and stillness. Sometimes Lena would stand in the doorway, her hand on the frame, feeling the profound wrongness of the silence. It was a space waiting for a return that would never come, a physical manifestation of their suspended, unending grief. Outside their window, the city was relentlessly rewriting itself. The sounds of Anacostia began to change, the familiar rhythm of the neighborhood disrupted by the percussive beat of construction. A high-end coffee shop with minimalist furniture opened where the old corner store used to be, selling lattes for the price of a Brooks family dinner. Old brick buildings, filled with the stories of generations, were torn down to make way for gleaming, anonymous condominium complexes. The gentrification that had once been a distant threat was now a reality, pushing at their edges, erasing the physical landmarks of their history. For Lena, watching the neighborhood transform was another form of violence. The city was not just forgetting Evan. It was actively bulldozing the world he had known, leaving their memories stranded, like ghosts in a landscape that no longer recognized them. The years carved themselves onto Maria's face, not as gentle lines of age, but as deep, sorrowful grooves. Grief was a slow poison, leaching the color from her hair and the light from her eyes. She moved through the apartment like a shadow of her former self, the vibrant, resilient woman who had held their world together now gone, replaced by this fragile, haunted figure. Her strength had been consumed by the unending strain of not knowing. She rarely spoke, and when she did, her voice was a thin, reedy whisper, as if the effort was too much to bear. Lena watched her mother fade, a slow, heartbreaking disintegration that felt like a second, ongoing loss. She was losing her not to a single violent event, but to the slow, corrosive drip of unresolved trauma, a daily erosion of the soul. Lena turned 30, then 32, the milestones passing without notice, like mile markers on a road she wasn't traveling. Her life had become a holding pattern. Friends from her youth sent wedding invitations, then birth announcements, their lives branching out into new chapters, while hers remained stuck on the same terrible page. The wooden easel in her room was now completely shrouded in dust, a monument to a dream she could no longer remember having. The hot, righteous anger of the early years had cooled into a hard, dense core of resolve that sat permanently in her gut. She no longer expected answers or justice. She simply endured, the sole custodian of her brother's memory and the silent witness to her mother's decline. She was no longer just a sister. She was a living memorial, defined by an absence. From the sterile silence of her night shift job, Lena watched the Thorne family's world flourish. Marcus Thorne's name became even more prominent, etched onto the foundations of new glass and steel towers that reshaped the city's skyline. She would occasionally search for Julian online, finding mentions of him in a university's alumni magazine or a brief notice about his successful career in finance in another state. Their lives were a public record of Forward momentum of success built upon a foundation of convenient silence. Each new accomplishment felt like a personal insult, a confirmation of the unbridgeable chasm between their worlds. They had the luxury of forgetting, of moving on. Their son was alive. Their future was intact. Their carefully constructed world had been preserved, while hers had been utterly and irrevocably demolished. The 10th anniversary of Evan's disappearance arrived on a cold, gray Friday, indistinguishable from any other. There were no news crews marking the grim milestone, no calls from a cold case detective. The city had long since moved on. That evening, Lena bought a single cupcake with blue frosting and placed it on the kitchen table, lighting the small candle. She and her mother sat in silence, watching the tiny flame flicker, the only light in the dim room. They didn't speak his name. They didn't need to. The date was a presence between them, a heavy, suffocating weight. After the candle burned down, Lena blew out the thin wisp of smoke, an unspoken wish for an answer she knew would never come. Evan Brooks was now a ghost that only 2 people in the entire world could still see. The community that had once rallied around them had scattered. Mrs. Gable from the 2nd floor had passed away 5 years ago, and Mr. Henderson, the man who saw the dark sedan, had died 2 years after that. New families, drawn by the neighborhood's changing reputation, now lived in their old apartments. They were polite but distant, strangers who knew nothing of the tragedy that haunted the 3rd floor. The shared sense of outrage and grief that had once bound the block together had dissolved with time, leaving the Brooks family completely isolated in their sorrow. Their pain, once a collective wound, was now a private, contained thing, a secret kept behind their own front door in a building that no longer remembered the name of the boy who had once lived there. 10 years of silence had changed its very nature. It was no longer just the absence of Evan's voice or laughter. It had become a physical presence in their apartment, a dense, suffocating atmosphere composed of every unanswered question, every unspoken fear, and every deferred dream. It was the silence of the police department's empty promises, the chilling silence from the Thorne family, and the vast, indifferent silence of a city that had erased a 12-year-old boy from its memory. Lena had learned to breathe this heavy air, to move within its crushing weight. It had seeped into her bones, shaping the woman she had become. The silence was no longer an intrusion. It was the foundation of her world, the constant, low, humming frequency of a loss that had no end. It began not with a bang, but with the groan of stressed metal and the grinding roar of a demolition crew. In the spring of 2025, a city development project, a sleek mixed-use complex bearing the Thorne corporate logo, started to tear down a derelict public library branch that had been shuttered for over a decade. It was a forgotten building in a forgotten corner of the city. On the 3rd day of the job, a worker clearing out the basement boiler room felt his crowbar hit something soft and yielding beneath a pile of rotted canvas tarps. It wasn't debris. It was a small, leathery backpack, remarkably preserved in the dry, stagnant air. And beneath it, a bundle wrapped in the same heavy tarp, small and light enough to be a child. The work crew fell, silent, the air suddenly thick with a history no one had known was there. The discovery was a procedural one at first. The police were called, a forensic team arrived, and the small, weathered backpack was carefully opened in a sterile lab. Inside, past a moldy history textbook and a half-eaten bag of chips, was a sketchbook. Its pages were stiff with age and dampness, but the graphite drawings within were shockingly clear. The first half of the book was filled with the familiar, vibrant life of Evan's world. Pigeons in flight, the tired faces of bus passengers, the intricate patterns of a fire escape. But the final pages were different. The drawings became hurried, the lines heavier, darker. They were all of one person, a man with a kind, familiar smile that Evan's pencil had somehow twisted into something predatory and unsettling. It was his history teacher, Mr. Alistair Finch, sketched over and over with a frantic, fearful energy. Simultaneously, in a different part of the city's vast bureaucratic machine, a new cold case unit was feeding old evidence into new systems. A tiny, degraded DNA sample, recovered 10 years ago from under Evan's fingernails on a jacket he'd left behind at the Thorne house, was run through a forensic genealogy database. For a decade, it had been a dead end. Now, the algorithm churned and found a match, not a direct one, but a distant familial link to a second cousin, twice removed. When the detectives built out the family tree from that distant relative, a single, unbelievable name emerged that connected directly to Evan's life. It was a name that had never once been considered a part of the investigation. It was the name of the man in the final haunted pages of the sketchbook, Alastair Finch. Armed with the drawings and the DNA link, two detectives drove to the manicured campus of another elite private school, where Mr. Finch was now the esteemed and beloved headmaster. He greeted them in his handsome, book-lined office, the picture of academic respectability. He was calm, articulate, and expressed a practiced, sorrowful memory of Evan, calling him a truly gifted, tragic boy. He answered their questions with an unnerving coolness, offering a plausible alibi for that long-ago evening and dismissing the drawings as a child's fantasy or misunderstanding. He was utterly convincing, a pillar of the community shielded by a decade of unimpeachable character. The detectives left with nothing but a growing sense of unease, the two pieces of their puzzle refusing to fit while he sat at its center. The news of the discovery at the old library was a minor item on the local news, but it was enough. In another state, a man named Julian Thorne, now 32 and working in finance, saw the headline online and felt a decade of carefully buried guilt rise up and choke him. The image of the small backpack was a key turning a lock in his memory that he had tried to rust shut. For 10 years he had lived with a secret, a small, cowardly silence that had grown into a monstrous weight. He had told himself it meant nothing, that he was just a kid, that he was scared, but seeing that backpack, he knew he could no longer carry it. With trembling hands, he looked up the number for the DC cold case unit and made the call he should have made 10 years ago. Julian's voice over the speakerphone in the detective's office was quiet, strained, the confession of a man unburdening a lifetime of regret. He told them that on that final afternoon, Evan had been agitated, scared. He had confided in Julian that Mr. Finch was making him uncomfortable. The teacher was giving him special attention, small gifts, offering him rides. Evan had felt that something was wrong, that the teacher's kindness was a mask for something else, something he couldn't name but that made his skin crawl. He had told Evan to just ignore it, to not make trouble. He was 12 years old, intimidated by the charismatic teacher and terrified of his own father's reaction to any hint of scandal connected to their family, and so he had said nothing. That single guilt-ridden testimony was the crack that broke the dam. When the detectives brought Alastair Finch in for a second interview, armed with Julian's statement, his composure finally fractured. The cool, articulate denial dissolved, and the truth came out in a flat, hollow torrent of words. He confessed it all. He had been grooming the boy. He had seen Evan walking from the Thorne house that evening and offered him a ride. His intentions predatory. In the car, Evan had panicked, threatened to tell his mother about the teacher's behavior. In a fit of rage and terror at his perfect life being exposed, Finch had struck him. A single brutal blow. Realizing what he'd done, he drove to the one place he knew no one would ever look. The basement of the abandoned library he passed every day. A place as forgotten and invisible as he believed the boy to be. The news came to Lena not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet, formal visit from a detective she had never met. He sat on the same worn sofa where Detective Harding had sat a decade before, and laid out the facts in the cold, procedural language of a police report. He spoke of DNA, of a witness, of a confession. Each word was a heavy, precisely placed stone, building a wall of truth that was both a prison and a final horrifying answer. Lena listened without moving, her hands resting in her lap. There was no outburst, no tears. There was only a profound internal shift, a silent, violent clicking into place of a puzzle she had carried for 10 years. The faceless monster that had haunted her every waking moment finally had a name, and it was the name of a man they had all trusted. In the aftermath, there was no sense of relief, no feeling of victory. The truth was not a cleansing fire, it was a poison that seeped into the foundations of every memory she had. The knowledge of Evan's final moments, the fear, the betrayal by a trusted adult, was an agony far sharper than the dull, constant ache of the unknown had ever been. She looked at her mother, who had received the news with a single guttural sob, before retreating into a silence so deep it seemed nothing would ever penetrate it again. The world had not been made right. It had simply been explained. The abstract horror had been replaced by a concrete, mundane evil. A secret kept not by a vast conspiracy, but by a child's fear and a powerful family's instinct for self-preservation. The city was stunned. The story of the heroic teacher and the tragic boy from the wrong side of town was instantly, violently rewritten. Alastair Finch was no longer a pillar of the community. He was a monster hiding in plain sight, his decade of accolades and respectability now a grotesque testament to his deception. For Lena, this public shock felt like a distant echo. The world was finally seeing the truth. But it was a truth she and her mother would have to live with long after the headlines faded. The revelation had not brought her brother back. It had only given his ghost a heavier chain to drag through the silent, grief-filled rooms of their apartment. A final brutal confirmation that some voids can never be filled, only understood. They buried Evan on a Tuesday, a day of relentless, weeping gray rain that seemed to wash the color from the world. The service was small, attended by only a handful of old neighbors whose faces were now etched with their own decade of sorrows, and the pastor who had led the first search parties so long ago. The casket was impossibly small, a stark physical confirmation of a life cut short. Lena stood beside her mother under a shared black umbrella, the rhythmic drumming of rain the only sound that seemed to make sense. She felt a profound, hollow numbness, the finality of the moment failing to provide any sense of closure. This was not an end to the pain, but merely a new chapter of it. They were not burying a boy. They were burying a ghost they had lived with for 10 years, and the truth of his end was a heavier burden than his absence had ever been. The revelation did not mend Maria's broken spirit. It shattered it completely. The cruel, fragile hope she had secretly nurtured for a decade, the impossible fantasy of a knock on the door, of a miraculous return, was now extinguished, replaced by the unbearable knowledge of her son's final, terrifying moments. She retreated into a silence that was deeper and more absolute than before. She no longer sat on the sofa staring at the television. She simply sat, her gaze fixed on the peeling paint of the opposite wall, her body present, but her mind lost in a landscape of unimaginable horror. Lena watched her mother become a living monument to grief, a woman hollowed out by a truth that offered no solace. Justice for Evan had become a life sentence for Maria. And in the suffocating quiet of their apartment, Lena understood that some wounds are too deep to ever become scars. A week after the funeral, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived, bearing the return address of a law firm in New York. Inside was a letter from Julian Thorne. It was a long, rambling confession of guilt, filled with the clumsy apologies of a man trying to buy his way back from a decade of cowardice. He wrote of his fear, of his father's shadow, of the secret he had carried like a stone in his gut. Tucked inside was a cashier's check for an amount that was, to them, astronomical, and to him, likely insignificant. Lena read the letter once, her expression unchanging, then slid it and the check back into the envelope. She felt no anger, no pity, not even contempt. There was only a vast, cold distance. His guilt was a luxury he could now afford to confess. Her loss was a debt that could never be repaid. One afternoon, Lena finally opened the door to Evan's room and stepped inside. The air was stale, a pocket of time preserved in dust. His sketchbooks were stacked neatly on his desk, artifacts from a life that felt a century old. She picked up the last one, the one the police had returned, its pages filled with the frantic, fearful drawings of his killer. For a long moment she held it, feeling the weight of the terror captured in the graphite. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she placed it on top of the stack, burying the monster among the pigeons and the portraits of tired bus riders. She walked to the corner of her own room, pulled the sheet from her old wooden easel and carried it into his. She set it up near the window, facing his empty desk, a silent, dusty sentinel in a room full of ghosts. That evening, the apartment was quieter than it had ever been. Lena sat at the kitchen table, the silence a physical presence, a third resident in their two-person home. Her gaze fell upon the object that had sat on the corner of the counter for 10 years, a permanent fixture of their suspended lives. Evan's sketchbook, left open. To the drawing of a pigeon taking flight, its wings outstretched, forever poised to soar. She stood up, walked over to it, and looked at the drawing for a final time. Then, with a slow, steady hand, she reached out and gently closed the book. The soft thud of the cardboard cover was the only sound in the room, a small, definitive punctuation mark at the end of a story that had no right to be over. The bird would never finish its journey. The waiting was done.